our stats regarding operations and talk about things that kind of stand out in the day-to-day departmental administration.
Well, the picture on operating budgets is not pretty at all in terms of the amount of money that's going to operating budgets. This is measured on a dollar per square foot basis. And as you can see, these budgets have been pretty flat since 2009. They were growing a little bit in 7, 8, but since 2009, a very slight growth, about 1% a year. You can see that the blue is the daily service costs, maintenance, custodial grounds, staffing, supervision, contracts, materials. The red is the planned maintenance amount. We can attribute to planned maintenance.
The party you have called is not available. Please record your message after the tone. When you have finished, you may hang up or press pound for further options.
I'm going to continue with this, but I assume that was some other technical problems. So I'm going to continue with this. But as you can see, the operating budgets have been flat, about 1% a year. We also track this with modest inflation numbers, about 2.5% increase in inflation. And you can see, had we had inflationary increases, and we apply this both public and private, we found that in public and private, we were ending up with about $5.22 a square foot for the public and about $5.33 a square foot for private institutions. And so what we're seeing is that we're just not keeping up with inflation, and as a result, we started looking at staffing levels, and you can see that staffing levels are increasing. This is represented as gross square feet per FTE, so coverage rates. The national average now is approaching 90,000 square foot per FTE. The public institutions are a little bit over 90. The private are just slightly under 90. But both of them have been increasing fairly steadily since 2009 when the recession hit and everybody began to really tighten their belts on the operations side. When we take a look at custodial coverage, almost a steadier increase in coverage rates, which means fewer staff. On the national average side, we've gone from just under 35,000 square foot per FTE to about 38,000. Public is now approaching as much as 40,000 square foot per FTE, and the privates are just under 35, but they were down in the low 30s at one point in time. So staffing is getting leaner. People are being stretched more. Operations are being stretched as we go along.
Great.
Do you have a question on the staffing side and the operations before we go to energy?
Yes, Jim, that was actually the question that came in that I wanted to wait for. It's about calculating staffing numbers. And the audience member acknowledges that there are so many standards and so many different ways for calculating staffing, but there seems to be no one-size-fits-all methodology. So the question is, how do we do it, and are there best practices for calculating staffing metrics? And I'm going to start to answer this question, and I think it's multifaceted. The first issue is, how do you get the number right? And you're absolutely right. There are so many different ways that we can calculate staffing, and over the years, we've learned how to be incredibly rigorous on this. And the first thing is getting that denominator correct. We spend a lot of time at institutions trying to figure out what's the right denominator, and usually it's gross square feet, but in the case of grounds, it might be acres. But there can be a number of different square footages for one institution, and in that case, you're absolutely right. There is no one-size-fits-all number. Knowing how to use what number when is very important. So when we typically go to a school, we will calculate the number of square feet up to 6 or 8 different ways: gross cleaned, energized, electrified, heated, cooled, etc. Figure out the best way to benchmark. And the other thing is getting the numerator correct. The other thing that is important to do is to look pretty critically in staffing, not only for your total working FTEs, but to make sure that you calculate the supervisory contribution correct. There are a lot of institutions where there's a lot of split responsibility. An employee might be supervising half the time, but also have that actual work responsibilities, and knowing what that number is affects your staffing ratios. But the other thing is knowing, getting an accurate count on the sold service component of your staffing, and knowing the correct number of square feet to compare those against. If you sell, basically, quote, sell FTEs to entities that are either auxiliaries or are not included in what you would call your maintenance footprint, you have to account for that, and that's important. That's aside from the issues of how do you interpret it and what does that number mean.
Yeah, and also contracting, if you contract out certain parts of your services, such as custodial or parts of your grounds, you'd have to calculate that. And also things like custodial staff spending times on moves and setups where they're not actually working in the buildings and cleaning the buildings. So I think, Jay, you've really hit it right on the head that you've got to be real careful and rigorous with these calculations when you do comparative metrics on the staffing side. Good.
Thanks, Jim. We're going to roll right into utility numbers. It is very close to operations, and then following this, we actually received we have a couple of examples from institutions that have folded utility consumption and operations to make real positive impacts at their campuses.
Well, the energy use story is actually a better story than we've shown with some of the other metrics, and that is that we've seen about a 7% decline in energy use. There was an increase from 12 to 13, primarily climate-driven because of cold winter across the country. But overall, we're seeing normalized energy use on a BTU per square foot basis going down. Campuses are getting more efficient. Buildings are getting more efficient. They're more rigorous about both use of fossil and electric, and have, in fact, been able to achieve that. That contrasts with the fact that total energy use is up, although remember what I just showed you in the earlier times on space, and total energy use is up around 2%. So when you just look at total MMBTUs, but as I showed you earlier, space is up around 6 or 7%. So actually, we've built a higher percentage of a new space than we've grown the energy total consumption, and as a result, the amount per gross square foot is actually going down. So I think we're seeing some positive trends on the energy side. One of the big trends that's very interesting is where fossil is coming from. In 2007, about 75% of the fossil consumption was natural gas, and 25% were other sources, coal in particular, oil as well as coal. Now that's down, has really shifted in a very short time, in 7 years, has gone to about 85% natural gas and about 15% everything else, particularly driven by switching from oil to natural gas in the Northeast, switching from both oil into natural gas in the South, as well as coal and oil in the Midwest to natural gas. So natural gas is becoming a real big source of fossil fuel, continues to increase, and been a pretty dramatic shift in a very short period of time. We're talking about millions of MMBTUs of consumption here. As a result, utility emissions are actually going down. So the combination of less consumption and cleaner fuels using natural gas has actually resulted in about a 13% decline on utility emissions. So the carbon footprint of colleges and universities is really going down, both when you measure it on a student FTE basis and per 1,000 gross square foot basis. So making some progress on the energy front, but primarily through fuel switching in some more efficient buildings and lower consumption.
Great, thanks, Jim. This is where I wanted to stop to answer the next question from the audience. And somebody specifically asked, we mentioned in our article a number of times how it is advantageous for an institution to increase planned maintenance and to try to use that to offset the daily service costs every year. The question is, can you highlight some strategies that have worked to effectively do that, being that resources are fairly scarce? So I wanted to actually talk about one institution that I have experience with that I thought did something fantastic, and that is they made the case to the senior ed administration to create a policy that sent and protected savings on the utility side, or at least a portion of them, to be reinvested into the campus to do more either energy conserving projects or actually increase planned maintenance dollars to slow the rate of deferral at the campus. And they did that on the back of a very effective energy management strategy. And over the last 5 years, this particular institution saw, a decrease in cost of about 6% over 5 years. That provided some amount, but very aggressive management led to actual 19% decrease in consumption on the campus. The actual net result of that was a 24% decline in cash expenditure on utilities. And because of the policy decision that they helped make, what they were able to do is shift a lot of that money into capital project spending. And if you click on that chart, Jim, you'll see that specifically they spent that money on mechanicals, envelopes, and infrastructure, specifically to save more energy and to fund capital projects that wouldn't get the programmatic allocations or the dollars from outside the campus that other types of more glamorous work would. At the same time that they did that, they actually used that money to also double the investment that they made in planned maintenance. A real positive move, using the money saved from utilities as a way to improve the campus as a whole and make the campus healthier in years to come as well.
I wanted to show also a second example here, Jay, because a lot of people say, well, if you've got some savings from the energy side, you can increase PM. But we were able to discover a campus here that actually has been seeing a shrinking dollar in terms of their operating budgets. When you look at the peers versus this campus, they're spending about $5.61 total operating budget versus $6.12. They were up over $6 a square foot back in 2007, but as you can see, they've hit pretty hard by cuts in the campus. They've gotten some recovery in the last couple of years, but when we take a look at them against their peers for this last year, just on the daily service side, they're just spending a little bit over $3 a square foot. Their peers are spending almost about $3.75 a square foot, and many of them are spending over $4 a square foot, and that's that daily service budget over time, which was close to $4 back in 2005 and dropped all the way below $3 and just slightly over $3. So you would expect that when you see these kind of cuts, one of the first things that goes is planned and preventive maintenance. People just say, when I'm getting cut staff and I don't have the resources, I'm just going to focus on that reactive work orders, those daily service calls, and forget about planned maintenance. But what's interesting is in the face of these cuts, this particular campus actually doubled the amount of planned and preventive maintenance. What the facility director did here is basically say, if I'm going to have less staff, I'm going to try to become more proactive with that staff. I'm going to get focused on setting priorities for the work orders that are coming in, not reacting to every daily service work order, so it's equal. Obviously, if you've got crisis issues or the roof's leaking and the toilets are overflowing, they're going to address those. But other minor calls were prioritized. They put them lower on the list, and they really became dedicated starting in 2012 and 13 to really be focused a lot more on planned and preventive maintenance. A lot of that's driven by both in-house and some external contracts, but basically they've doubled the amount. They're above the peer average now in the face of pretty significant cuts over a period of about 6 or 8 years. So give them a lot of credit. Their jury's still out. They've just started doing it the last couple of years, but they say they're seeing positive results on the campus and positive reaction from the campus community that they're getting ahead of the problem.
Wonderful. Jim, I'm gonna pause right here and ask you a couple of the questions that have come in over the last few minutes here, and one of them goes back to staffing. The viewer is wondering how much the increase in square feet per FTE is based upon the application of new technology versus constrained labor resources. And I would actually provide option 3, which is new technology driven by the fact that there are constrained financial resources.
Yeah, I think that's exactly what's happening out there, is that, necessity is the mother of invention, right? People have been getting cuts. They've extended their staff. And in many cases, it's not even cuts, Jay. It's adding square footage without adding staff. So we've added 6% additional square footage, but we're not adding more people. We're just making our current people extend their work across that square footage. Now, in some cases, that can happen because it's newer square footage, and as a result, doesn't maybe need as much attention or can be handled through a good PM program. But in other cases, I think there's been a number of campuses that we've seen that have introduced new technology, different ways of cleaning methodologies, green cleaning, different types of equipment. They have also been able to use some more creative maintenance practices that have allowed them to use technology, track their work orders better. Many campuses are now using iPads and an iPhone kind of technology to be able to track calls and be able to allocate their staff more efficiently. So I think people have technology that's making a difference in both on the maintenance and the custodial side, and in terms of understanding work orders and managing work orders better.
Thanks, Jim. And another question that we have that I'll start to answer, but you can absolutely elaborate on, it is regarding utility consumption. And the audience member, acknowledges that community colleges are absolutely going to have lower utility consumption or very different utility consumption or utility needs than, say, a larger research university. And how do we break out space types and institution types to better tell a story? A lot of those, the easy answer to that is absolutely. We do break it down in finer detail, and for the sake of time, we didn't add a lot of those slides in here. But off the top of my head, when we're compiling data and when we're trying to find best practices and really what the average numbers are across groups, we are looking at things like size of institution, the constituent group of that institution, the Carnegie class of that institution, climate zone of that institution, region of the institution, and interesting things like the percentage of residential students on the campus or the percentage of research space of that institution. So yeah, we do work pretty hard to break down those numbers. And if you see at a lot of our more regular blogs or in a lot of our monthly newsletters, you'll see a lot more detail as we drill down into particular areas of facility operations.
I think with community colleges, of course, the density number is a telling number. I think typically our small liberal arts institutions, four-year liberal arts institutions, would have a density of about 250 students per every 100,000 square feet. Research and comprehensive institutions more like 350, urban institutions more like 500. Community colleges can run 750 to 1,000 in terms of the number of people per 100,000 square feet. So they have less space, more students, more concentration of students. But also the other factor here is that community colleges' time of operation is longer. People will come in starting early in the morning and they'll have classes all the way to 10, 11 o'clock at night. That means things like coverage rates for custodial are change a lot, because you've got to have a group that's cleaning at night for the group in the morning and another group that's coming in late in the afternoon cleaning for the next group at night. And so you've got multiple shifts here, the custodial staff, that always have to be attentive, and we really see that reflected in the metrics for community colleges. So they're kind of unique in high-density institutions, and we look at them in a very different lens than we do, say, a small liberal arts college.
Absolutely. And